All right, everybody, we've made it to the first affirmative constructive, typically just called the 1AC. This is going to be a very important video because one of your big assignments for the remainder of the semester will be constructing your very own first affirmative constructive. It'll be worth 50 points. It's a big assignment. Think of it like the draft of your actual speech. And just as a useful tip, please be sure to check this checklist that I have posted on Canvas that goes through step by step all of the things you need to remember to have. If you go through this and you have all of these components, you're going to set yourself up for a pretty good grade on the assignment. The way that you really hurt yourself in terms of the grading of this assignment is if you're just blatantly missing some of these components. So I'm going to go through and define all of these in the video itself, but just be sure to return to this video if you need any clarification, and certainly to use this checklist. So let's hop on in. The first affirmative constructive, as you already know, is the first speech of the debate where the affirmative presents their case. They lay out the basic harms that are the problems that are being caused in the status quo. They lay out a basic inherency story of why the problem has not been solved yet. And finally, they introduce a plan and describe why their plan would fix the problems in solvency. So the goal of this speech is to explain why there's a problem in the status quo that warrants passing a United States federal government plan to fix it. That's the ultimate goal. And this is the only speech in the debate that is entirely written beforehand. Now, the next speech, the first negative constructive, often is pretty well prepared, especially on the novice level. You'll know exactly what affirmatives you're going to be facing. And so, most negative teams will have an idea of what pieces of evidence and what arguments they will make. But nevertheless, every affirmative constructs their case a little bit differently, and so a negative team always has to adapt. Whereas the 1AC is always the first speech of the debate, so they get to pre-write their speech, and they just read it for the first speech. It's entirely pre-written, just read. So here's the structure of the 1AC, and I'm going to go over each of these components, but I think it'd be useful to have this outlined in your notes so that you understand the overall structure, and then we'll go into detail on each of them. So it begins with an introduction. Very similar to a speech, though we'll see the intro in a debate in a 1AC is very different than your speech intros in like an original oratory, for instance. Second is harms and significance. Third is inherency. Fourth is the plan text. Fifth is solvency. It's almost as if it's following the same exact sequential order as the stock issue videos that I created. And then sixth is the conclusion. Pretty straightforward. Here are some tips to remember as I go through these throughout the video. First, you write the intro and the conclusion last after you've completed the stock issues. Very foolish move freshmen often make is they think that they're going to start by writing the introduction. Just trust me, just like an essay for an English class or a history class, you can't write the introduction until you know what you're going to be arguing. And the only way you know really what you're going to be arguing is after you've written your body paragraphs, or in this case, after you've written your stock issues, after you've constructed those parts of the speech. Do lots of research to put the best evidence in this speech. Some people think, we'll just put some of our weaker evidence in this speech and then we'll really get them in the 2AC in the next affirmative speech. That's a very foolish way of thinking. Ideally, if you play your cards right, the 1AC should establish all of the really, really good important evidence for the affirmative team so that they don't actually have to read a ton of evidence for the remainder of the debate. There will be times where you certainly have to read evidence, but a good affirmative team can just lean on their 1AC evidence and do a lot of explaining of what the 1AC evidence said as opposed to having to read a ton of evidence in their next affirmative speech. Next, make sure to provide transitions to the stock issues where you define for the judge what the stock issue is. So this would look like, first, we'll begin with the stock issue of harms and significance, where we'll see the serious problems that giving police military equipment causes in the status quo. Something like that. Remember to time the 1AC after you construct it. The expectation is it will be right around 8 minutes. It should not be seriously under 8 minutes. And note, it cannot go over. Unlike speech, there's no grace period. You can't go on for 30 seconds afterwards and the judge give you a thumbs up as if it's okay. The expectation is as soon as the timer starts ringing at 8 minutes, you need to finish the sentence and sit down. There's no grace period. So let's go in step by step, all right? Let's go in step by step. And actually, let me just show you basically what a 1AC is going to look like. Notice you're going to use the card template. Now, this was a different template than the one you all are using this year, but nevertheless, the same principles basically apply. You'll see the intro is on the first page. Then you'll start getting to harms. And notice it's all structured in that evidence template, right? Where you have, a tag up here. You have the site right here. You have the evidence highlighted right there. Then you'll move on to the next harms argument, so on and so forth. So you have a couple harms arguments. Then you'll transition to inherency. So I'm going to go through and come back to each of this, but I just want to give you a flavor. Notice this is the plan entirely in your own words as opposed to, a card text right there. Then you'll have solvency right here. Then you'll have solvency down here, and then you'll have a conclusion. So notice this looks very different than, say, the speech that you wrote for the speech unit of the class, because it's entirely about assembling a case full of evidence to support your basic ideas. So that's just going to look very different. But let's go back to the PowerPoint where I'll break this down. So the intro. Intro is typically around 8 to 12 sentences. And it should be about 25 to 40 seconds. Again, write the intro last. And the key to the intro, after you've constructed all of your stock issues, is to really think about the core of the affirmative story. What is the most important idea that the judge should know in order to understand the affirmative? What is the core idea of the affirmative? And hint, I think the inherency story is oftentimes a really good place to focus on, right? If you're talking about pharmaceutical company, or if you're talking about the opioid crisis, if that was the harms of your affirmative case and you're going to present a plan to get rid of it, I think a really good core to focus on is the fact that pharmaceutical companies have spent billions of dollars lobbying the government and your doctors to push these pills onto unknowing patients. That type of narrative would just be very, very compelling, even more so than just listing the statistics of how many people are dying. The audience will get that, but if you get at this core idea of greed and exploitation, that's really powerful. Next, is there any background info that is absolutely essential for a judge to know in order to understand the affirmative? If so, that's typically in the intro, something that wouldn't necessarily be in your evidence, but it's just important background context. Then you want to provide that in the intro here, just so that the judge isn't confused about what's going on. A good example of this was last year. The topic was about arms sales, and one of the main affirmatives the Bellarmine teams read was about Saudi Arabia. Now, most people know Saudi Arabia, they probably associate it with human rights abuses, the beheading of, or the killing of Khashoggi, a journalist there. And they probably don't know a lot about the intricacies of American arms sales. Even more so, they probably know very little about the war in Yemen. And little do they know that, Saudi Arabia, the United States is selling Saudi Arabia billions of dollars of military weapons to be involved in a war that's not in their own country. So all of that background information was probably pretty important for the judge to understand, that there was a war in Yemen, that Saudi Arabia had gotten involved, and that the U.S. was selling Saudi Arabia more weapons than any other country in the world. That said, don't turn this into a long history lesson. It needs to be short and to the point. Next, avoid cliches and bad writing. Just overly flowery, vague rhetoric that doesn't really mean anything and just is trying to sound good without actually getting to the core of the affirmative or giving us necessary background information is bad. Another one is just like a sob story. If you were just like, in one town in the United States, in June of 2008, little Jimmy Two Shoes was running down the street when all of a sudden his shoes came untied and he tripped and fell and he was sad. That type of sob story, it's just not as effective, actually. It's just telling the overall narrative of the affirmative, which is about getting to that core idea. Don't tell me one person who's died from opioids. Establish that bigger picture of pharmaceutical companies have been bribing doctors and the government to push these very addictive products onto us, the patient. That is more powerful than just hearing one sob story. And don't summarize the stock issues. There's a difference between getting to the core of your affirmative, which is about prioritizing the most important idea, and summarizing all of the stock issues one after the other. At that point, just skip the introduction and get to the stock issues. I'm not actually saying skip the intro. I'm just saying that summarizing the stock issues wouldn't be worth it. And at the end of the intro, make sure to restate the year's resolution, right? So it'd look like, thus, my partner and I stand resolved. This is always the last sentence of the intro, whatever the resolution is. Thus, my partner and I stand resolved. The United States federal government should enact substantial criminal justice reform in the U.S. in one or more of the following areas: forensic science, policing, sentencing. So notice, right, whatever the resolution is, you just copy and paste it there. But you need to restate the year's resolution so everybody in the room knows what we're talking about. Actually, let's real quick take a look, over here. So just notice what this looks like, right? In this intro, this was about immigration reform. You can see here, should substantially reduce its restrictions on legal immigration. This affirmative was about letting Syrian refugees into the United States. Notice the intro provides some background info on the Syrian civil war. It's forced millions of Syrian citizens to abandon their homes. Every day, thousands of Syrians flee across the border to seek refuge in neighboring countries. However, instead of providing a home, countries like Turkey, Jordan, and Lebanon force refugees into overcrowded refugee camps. So it's time for the United States to pick up the slack. As the world's democratic leader, we have the capabilities and infrastructure to open our doors. So notice here, kind of getting at the core story. Most people know about the Syrian civil war, so they didn't have to spend a lot of time here. Instead, they focus on the fact that the Syrians fleeing out of their country really are being put in these horrific conditions, and that the United States isn't doing enough. If you ask yourself at the end of the day, what does a judge need to understand this affirmative, those were the two core ideas. So hopefully that makes sense. Again, I'm going to have a whole folder full of example 1ACs that you can go look at, but hopefully me showing you a concrete example during this video makes some sense. Next is harms and significance. For harms and significance, you should have 2 to 4 pieces of evidence, and the more specific your harms, the better. Give specific numbers, make the harms concrete, all the principles for any speech event, which is about establishing a problem, like original oratory or original advocacy, typically apply here, especially those for original advocacy. You want to persuade your judge that there's a serious problem, so you don't want it to be vague and nebulous. Moreover, try to diversify your harms. Ideally, you can show that the same root cause impacts societies in different and distinct ways. So, if there are health effects of the problem that you're identifying, have that be one harm. Then have a second harm be about the economic ramifications. If you can diversify it, it's good. It'll just provide more reasons why your plan is a good idea, as opposed to avoid just having like 3 pieces of evidence that are all just saying the same thing. If you just have 3 pieces of evidence all saying that opioids are killing people, fundamentally that's not doing a whole lot, right? But if you have 1 piece of evidence that says opioids are killing this many people because they're getting addicted and overdosing, and then second, you show the economic impacts that is having, that's much more compelling. Pick the most important harms. Only include harms if you're going to want to talk about them in the final rebuttals. Sometimes I see novices put in, a 3rd or 4th harm that they're really not going to ever talk about, and it's just kind of a throwaway. Don't do that. It's just a waste of time. Only put in, the 1AC is such an important and valuable speech. You should only put in absolutely what you want to talk about in the final speeches of the debate. And include convincing rhetoric, especially in your evidence, right? Your evidence ideally should sound good rhetorically to make the judge feel compelled by the harms. And this shouldn't be empty rhetoric, obviously. It needs to be backed up by substance, but you want the evidence itself to sound scary for the judge to be like, oh my goodness, this is really, really serious. So again, let's go over and look at what this looks like. So you'll see here, right? Notice they define the stock issue. Don't forget to define it. We start with the stock issue of harms. We'll explain how the United States refusing to help Syrian refugees subjects them to violence in the war-torn Middle East. So it establishes that we're going to be talking about problems. First, because the U.S. refuses to admit Syrian refugees, millions of refugees remain trapped in Syria with nowhere to go. Every day they remain puts them at risk of being killed in the civil war. And remember, your tag should just be 1 or 2 sentences, 2 sentences max. You can't have like a little mini paragraph here. And then they have the site, and then they have the evidence. And you can see here, this evidence is powerful. Like, the Assad regime began massacring and expelling families. Over 100 civilians were killed every day. The regime fired sarin gas at suburbs. This has produced the refugee catastrophe. 13.5 million Syrians are in need of assistance. 10.6 million have been forced to flee their homes. 6 million are internally displaced, and more than half of the refugees are children. I mean, wow, that's powerful, right? That's powerful stuff. And so then they have 2 more harms, right, that they're put into these overcrowded, unsanitary, temporary refugee camps that are really bad. And then they have a 3rd one that these countries are starting to turn them away. So, okay, and then we move on to inherency. So hopefully that makes sense. You can look at that in your free time. Inherency, shorter, typically 1 or 2 pieces of evidence. What you want to do is establish the culprit and show examples of how the culprit has frustrated previous attempts to solve the problem. And you want to include powerful rhetoric and figurative language here that gets to the core of the problem. Again, I think the examples I gave when talking about the intro really apply here. If it's exploitation, if it's greed, if it's neglect, really get at that core idea and bring in that powerful rhetoric, because this is often where the greatest injustice is happening, that there is some self-interested culprit standing behind these decisions, or there's some foolish attitude that's been perpetuating a certain set of policies. That can be quite powerful. So, rhetoric like lobbyists have been holding our education hostage. That's a very powerful line. Or politicians have been too narrow-minded in their selfish pursuit of re-election to focus on long-term solutions. So this type of rhetoric can really help the audience, especially the judge in particular, to understand how all of these stock issues fit together. I think of inherency as a really good glue or a bridge between harms and solvency to help them understand what's really getting in the way of fixing the problem. So let's go over here and take a look. So on inherency, obviously this inherency story was pretty straightforward because at the time, the president was pretty against letting Syrian refugees into the United States, and he was pretty vocal about his stance on immigration. So there wasn't a lot of work that needed to get done here. But anyways, right, they read a piece of evidence saying Trump wants to change the narrative. He's determined to end the admission of Syrian refugees. In 2016, last year of Obama, we let in 15,000. Last year, we let in only 11. So we can see there, like, this inherency story is pretty direct and straightforward. Next, the problem is that despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary, Trump wants us to believe that all refugees from Syria are terrorists. And so notice here, what is this going to set up very well? It's going to set up a good response to a disadvantage, which is the fear that people coming from a war-torn country with radical Islam in it could potentially come over to the United States with radical ideas and be terrorists themselves. And so this evidence, I think, did a really good job of simultaneously establishing that fears of terrorism are motivating or allowing Trump to justify eliminating Syrian refugees, but that also that those fears are seriously overblown. There is a 1 in 3.6 billion chance that they are actually terrorists. Pretty low. So let's keep going. The plain text should be just 1 to 2 sentences, very straightforward. Avoid overly vague plain texts, like the United States federal government should reform policing. Be specific about what you want to reform. Are you ending the sale of military equipment? Are you ending a certain police tactic? Are you putting body cameras onto police? Be specific about what your plan is. Next, the United States federal government should reform its criminal justice laws. Again, what laws are being reformed? And include only what is absolutely necessary. Avoid plain texts that are too long. And make sure you have a specific solvency advocate and qualified experts to support your plain text. So you're not going to introduce those solvency advocates or the qualified experts at this point. You're going to introduce it in solvency. But a big mistake I see novices make is they'll just kind of wave a magic wand, come up with a plain text out of nowhere. And I'll ask them, where did you get this? What was the evidence to support this? And they said, oh, I just thought I needed to invent one. Trust me, you guys are not qualified policymakers. I hate to break it to you if you think you are. Your job is to find qualified experts who are advocating specific plans and to use that research to then create a plan text based on what they have said. So it should not just be your own magic wand plan. It should be something that is based very much in the evidence. So let's just go down here and take a look. So don't forget the transition as always. Notice the transition was up here for inherency as well. Next we move on to the stock issue of inherency, and it explains what the stock issue is. Going down to solvency, right? It's time the United States opens its doors to refugees looking to start a new life. So notice that kind of rhetorical sentence that's like, it's time to change. I think that's powerful. And then thus my partner and I propose the following plan. You should always have this line in here because it helps to signal to everyone in the room that you are about to read exactly what you are advocating. And then notice here, 3 sentences. So this is a longer plain text than normal, but nevertheless, you can see here, it details very specifically what it's allowing to allow 110,000 refugees to enter the U.S., waiving all conflicting executive orders and legislation. We'd eliminate the checks and restrictions that Trump put into place and return to the Obama administration's policy for admitting refugees, and the president would comply with this policy. Oh, I see. This last sentence was just because a lot of people would say President Trump wouldn't comply with a policy that explicitly lets in Syrian refugees. So they just put in a sentence that said he should. But this was an annoying argument. Anyways, and then they say, well, we'll be happy to clarify in cross-examination. Typically a good line to have in there just to make it clear that you're more than happy to clarify any part of this. Let's go back. Solvency. We're almost there, guys. Should have 2 to 3 pieces of evidence. Make sure the evidence is really good quality. Again, I've said that already, but solvency is really important because harms and inherency, the negative team might put some defensive arguments on those stock issues, but really, if you lose solvency, you could lose the debate. Because if the judge is persuaded that your plan doesn't work, that's a pretty compelling reason why the plan would be a bad idea, right? And so you want the most qualified authors, the best warrants, and the most rigorous research methodologies. Do not skimp on solvency. If you skimp on solvency, you will open yourself up to huge attacks that will really undermine the affirmative. Moreover, make sure your solvency evidence is specific to your plan. Every plan needs a solvency advocate. I already said this in the last slide, but I want to reiterate it. You need to make sure you are not inventing your plan out of nowhere, but that it's actually supported by the evidence. Your evidence can help to explain more of the logistics and the specific details of what your plan does and how it'd be implemented. So you don't have to have an 8-line or 8-sentence long plan text. You can have a shorter plan text, and then on the stock issue of solvency, you could probably explain a little bit more how the logistics and specific details work by reading the evidence. And make sure to provide warrants why the plan would solve the harms you've outlined. And so the best warrants are often empirical, is tried elsewhere and had great results, but it doesn't always have to be empirical. But empirical warrants are pretty good, pretty hard to beat, right? So that's my basic 2 cents on solvency, is make sure that you basically show that there are experts backing up the plan and describing what the plan is. And second, making sure that you're providing reasons why the plan fixes the problems. So let's go on over here. You'll see at this point you should be getting the idea. Make sure to transition to solvency, define the stock issue, provide the tag. Returning to Obama administration's refugee policy would ensure Syrian citizens are safe within the United States. So notice that you got that empirical example. This is what we did under Obama. Second, studies shown that refugees benefit the U.S. economy. So you got a nice little reason why it'd be good. Feels incredible. All right, and finally, the conclusion. Should be 3 to 5 sentences, maybe a little bit longer, but it's pretty short, 20 seconds maybe. And just remind the judge of the most important issue of the 1AC, typically that combo meal of harms and inherency. Remember to get back to the core of the case, explain in the most direct and powerful way why the judge should want to pass the affirmative plan, or why it's a good idea. And the typical story, right? Obviously, this is very generic. You want to make this very specific, is there's a big problem. There's a malicious culprit, and we need to pass sensible policies that are supported by the experts. And so that's it. Let's go take a look. So, in this case, look at this. It's just 2 sentences. Beautiful. It's time we fulfill our promise to the world. The nation of immigrants has a new challenge in the form of Syria. America may have no moral duty to put out fires around the world, but it does have a moral duty not to block the exits. All right, so that's a 1AC, guys. Hopefully that makes sense. My biggest pieces of advice is, first, make sure to be checking this checklist constantly. Second, look through those 1ACs that I post on Canvas so that you can see all of the different examples of good affirmatives in the past and really study it. The more you study what those examples look like, and the more you try to mimic that basic structure in your own 1AC, the better off you'll be. Where you'll run into problems is if you try to do something totally different, and then at the end of the day, I ask you, why did you think you should do it like this? And you're like, I don't really know. And then you look at a varsity 1AC and see it's totally different. And if you had just looked at it, you would have realized that we want to avoid that. And third, I really recommend go to student coaching. All right, we have a lot of policy debaters on the team. We have over 50 policy debaters. There will always be tons of guys who can help you out in student coaching. So please show up. please make sure to get some feedback on your 1AC as you're trying to work on it, get critiques on whether your evidence seems good or not, and that will help you out. So hopefully this video made sense and helped to clarify what the first affirmative speech looks like and feels like. If you have any questions, let me know.